Hi, welcome to episode 43 of Talk About the Passion, Loose. As with all episodes of this podcast, this one is named after a song, particularly the song Loose by the Stooges. A few of these episode titles may have some deep meaning attached to the conversation, but since this conversation was pretty loose, and we talked a little bit about the Stooges, it seemed to fit perfect, and that's that. I've known Dan Brockman for around 17 years now. My old band Presley played a couple of shows with his band, The Hidden. He mentions he played with his previous band, Medea Connection, but I feel like it was The Hidden, actually. Regardless, we don't actually talk much about either of those bands, and that was completely fine with me. I've always been interested in Daniel as a writer, even back when we both frequented the Boston music scene message board, the noise board, which could be a pretty obnoxious place from time to time. On the occasion, though, where there was a serious music thread, Dan would always form these long, sort of well thought out replies that may have been like an essay for someone like me. And then, of course, the usual troll would just reply with, "Yeah, well, Genesis sucks," and you'd think, "Oh man, really? Come on." Anyway, Dan then, became published in a number of local and international magazines and websites, Vanyaland, Spin, Rolling Stone. His writing is heavy and provocative, and I love his views on music, even the ones I don't necessarily agree with. I was glad to have this conversation. We hadn't spoken in a while, so it was nice to catch up, and he's always an amazing person to just listen to talk about music. He's got some really interesting opinions and ideas, and as you'll hear on this conversation does go all over the place, and I think it came out great. We talk, mostly about journalism and that kind of thing, and some of the challenges he's had interviewing people like John Lydon and Danzig, and then doing people like Robyn Hitchcock, who he wasn't that familiar with. This might be the only person, I think, too, where I could have a conversation that begins at the Dave Matthews Band and then somehow ends up at the Stooges. Anyway, enough about me. I'm on social media, Facebook, Instagram. Please give me a follow there to stay in touch and keep up to date when new episodes are coming out. You can also contact me there if you or someone you know would like to be on this podcast. So just send me a message there and we can set something up. You can listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, even YouTube at this point. Just search for Talk About the Passion podcast, and you should be able to find me. Anyway, let's start this up. Episode 43, Loose, with Daniel Brockman. Thanks for listening. Cool. All right, so I'm here with, well, not here, I'm on the phone with my good friend Daniel Brockman. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Good to hear. Where did you grow up? You grew up in Syracuse, is that correct?
Oh, fuck me. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a few places, but mostly Syracuse, New York. Yeah.
And as a kid, how early were you getting into music and entertaining yourself?
I've listened to a number of interviews you've done with other people, and I feel like I am like the dorkiest example of everyone, because like whenever especially people who are into the hardcore in the 80s, like, okay, I didn't see a show of any kind until the late 80s.
Right.
And the first concert I ever went to was fucking post Peter Cetera Chicago at the New York State Fair with my father.
Yeah.
And so like I by that point, like, we're talking 88, and like, so any cool thing that would have happened before then, didn't know about it.
Right,
it was nothing but listening to Weird Al and shit like that. And so, like, stuff may have come through Syracuse.
Right.
Apparently there was some cool stuff. I knew nothing about it. The first real club concert I ever saw was when the Dead Milkmen and Mojo Nixon came to the Lost Horizon in Syracuse.
Yeah.
The Lost Horizon was like the big punk club, and it's mostly renowned for having had an enormous pole in the center of the stage. So like anytime I would ever read stuff over the years in Syracuse where people like legendary bands would talk about coming to Syracuse or coming to the Lost, it was always like, oh yeah, that place with the giant pole in the center of the stage. And I was like, that's what we're known for.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Paradise used to be, I guess.
Oh yeah, they
but
had
worse.
that big pole. Yeah. But
It was like if the Paradise were smaller
Yeah.
and the pole were right on the stage.
Right.
Like there must have, I don't know, there must have been some union thing or some code reason.
Huh.
But yeah, and I remember seeing the Dead Milkmen and Mojo Nixon. The opening band was Boston legends, the Cave Dogs, who I've never heard a note of since that show.
Yeah.
But I remember, at that point it was probably '89 or so, and I'd seen a couple like larger shows, and all I could think was like, I'd been listening to Dead Milkmen for like 5 years, and they were like my favorite band in the world.
Right.
And seeing them on this like little stage, well, what I thought with this, it was a sold out crowd, but I was like, I just felt bad for them. I was just doing the whole show. I was just doing the math in my head, and I was like thinking, oh man, they're not making any money off of this show. Like, it was literally what I was thinking of my first club show. I was like, man, they're not the big stars I thought they were. Like, they're just playing this rinky-dink little place, and I'm sure to them this was like the highlight. This was like when Punk Rock Girl was on MTV. I have a feeling for them this was their raking in the cash moment that would never happen again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was my impression of like a club concert. But then I don't know. Then the early '90s happened, and I was in college, and then I saw everything. And it was always in clubs and stuff. And then it wasn't cool to see larger shows for a while.
Yeah. and you went to college in Virginia, right?
Yeah, that's right. I went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which meant that I saw the Dave Matthews Band at least 5 times without intending to see them at parties and things like that, which is to this day just a baffling phenomenon to me.
Yeah. Yeah, now they're playing. I don't know if they're still playing stadiums, but that is.
They were playing stadiums while I was in college. They went from band playing a club to playing stadiums in about 3 years of my being at college.
That's crazy.
So like it was, I mean, I don't know. I honestly think in all of my years since, I have never seen a band of any local whatever get that big that quickly. It'll probably never happen again.
Yeah.
Like, even like, I don't know, when we were in Boston and, name whatever big band from Boston, the Dresden Dolls or whatever, they didn't get that big. And they didn't get back to that. They didn't get that big that quickly.
Yeah.
So it's absolutely like, and imagine it's like the worst band you've ever seen, and they got big. The other thing I always think about the first couple of times, the first couple of times I saw the Dave Matthews Band, I thought it was 1991, and I thought, these guys are talented, but what kids would never be into this kind of music. That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Because I was like, okay, you've got these middle-aged jazz guys and this guy in pajamas playing an acoustic guitar and a saxophonist.
Right.
And the bassist that I guess he's still their bassist. His dad owned like the music shop in town in Charlottesville.
Oh, right. Yeah. So
Stefan Lessard. So his dad was Ron Lessard, who owned Lessard's, and so I was like, oh, it's this is just like I knew who these people were. They were like the guys who like hung around town. The violin player who I recently read had been kicked out of the band in some Me Too related scandal. He was he had this band prior to being in the Dave Matthews Band called the Boyd Tinsley Band, and it was like he played like electric violins for all these pedals and distortion. And I saw them once randomly. I used to go to college. You go to a club without knowing who you're seeing. I saw him one time, and he was just shredding. And I was like, wow, he rules. And then like I remember, a year later seeing him on MTV in like a Dave Matthews tour jacket on stage, and I was like, he was playing like Coda and shit, and I was like, man, I could see why you did it, buddy, but that sucks. Like, I don't know. And now I'm one of those people who's like, oh, I remember before you sold out. Oh, God.
I know, and it's not even like a good one that you can brag about, like that
exactly. It's the worst. To me, it's emblematic of the '90s. The '90s suck. And like, I remember at the time, I don't know, people our age were like, oh man, we're going to see you meet old guys who are like, oh, I saw Hendrix in 1968 or whatever.
Yeah.
I saw, I remember, people like, I saw the Who, and they didn't really have amps, so they broke. That was fake or whatever.
Right.
And I was like, oh man, we're going to get our chance to, see our things. And like, at a certain point, I hit like 30-something, and I was like, I think that was it.
Yeah,
I think what I saw there was it.
Yeah, no one's going to care that I saw a steel pole bathtub 35 years from now.
Right. Like, I don't know. I remember like seeing My Bloody Valentine at UVA with Dinosaur Jr. and the ever ubiquitous Superchunk as the opener, and I remember being like, oh man, this is the show I'm going to tell my grandkids about or whatever. And I get older, and I'm like, maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, they were really loud. Yeah, they're like, wow, a loud band? Who knew? Like, who knew bands play loud? Wow, that's crazy.
Right. Did you were you playing guitar as a when you were younger? Did you start that early?
That's interesting. I was a very late. I had like no. Not only did I have no musical training, but I just had no musical I had no interaction with live human beings playing instruments.
Yeah.
Until I was like in college, basically, or high school. I remember in high school, it was like, I feel like when I first got into rock, like for real, in high school, and then college, it was like I just wanted to be in proximity of a drum set.
Right.
Because like it's hard to get in proximity of a drum set. They were really loud, and someone had to own one.
Right.
And like, I don't know. You'd go. I remember seeing like the Rolling Stones on the Steel Wheels tour, and you're like, yeah, look at that drum set a mile away from where I'm standing, and that's pretty awesome. And then when I was in college, I'd go to shows at clubs. It was just like, wow, I'm so close to this band playing. I remember there's another uncool show I saw my first year at college. I saw Widespread Panic before they were that big.
Oh, geez.
And because I don't know if like you obviously remember in 1991, everyone was like, the thing is going to be jam band. Yeah. That's going to be it.
Yeah.
Like,
I got sucked into that for a few years.
Why not? Some of that stuff was pretty interesting. I remember being very into a band called All Good.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
Man, this conversation is not going where I thought it was going to go. But, sorry. But,
let's talk about the Misfits. No, I'm just kidding. No.
Right. No, this is what I was trying to say at the beginning. Like, this conversation is not going to be that cool if we're talking about my actual experience. I remember Widespread Panic, and I saw All Good numerous times. Colonel Bruce Hampton and the Aquarium Rescue Unit.
Yeah, that band was interesting, actually. They stood out.
Well, what I realize now is I was in college in Virginia, which is, I guess, the South. And, they have monuments to Robert E. Lee in your town. You're in the South. And I think I was at ground zero for jam band experimentation at college level, apparently. So all the cool stuff wasn't coming to Charlottesville, but I got to see all those bands before they were big a year later and then petered out.
Did none of those bands ever mixed though? You wouldn't see Superchunk with
No, but here's what's interesting to me about all that stuff was they were classic rock aspirants.
Right. Yeah.
So, for instance, eventually the bassist for the Aquarium Rescue Unit was this 5-string player named Oteil Burbridge, who has now been the bassist for the Allman Brothers Band for 30 years at this point, probably.
Yeah. And the Dead. So all those bands. He's with the Dead too, with and the John
Dead.
May.
Yeah. Right. So it's all that stuff. I grew up listening to classic rock radio and when I went to college, in 1991, it was now everyone brands everything as this Nirvana alternative thing, but it was still for me filtered through classic rock,
right?
And so those bands made sense to me. Not like I was being choosy, but when I would see them, I was like, oh, I get this. This is music that sounds like the Allman Brothers Band. The Allman Brothers Band is a band I've heard on the radio all the time. I can get this.
Right.
And I feel like I don't know. There was no cool stuff. It's funny because right when I was going to college, I guess probably the Pavement people had like just left UVA and were becoming enormously huge a year
Right.
later with Pavement, and so they had this like University of Virginia connection that I wasn't that privy to.
Huh.
But I saw them a few times in Charlottesville, and
Yeah.
they I don't know, they were just a touring rock band,
Right.
like anyone else.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And you eventually made your way up to Boston, and that's how I know you from.
Right. My wife grew up in Boston, and after UVA in '95, we moved there,
Mm-hmm.
and so I moved there in the summer of '95, and yeah, I feel like everything in my life, I arrived right when the party ended.
Yeah.
And so it was like when I got to UVA in 1991, there had been enormous drug busts
Right.
at UVA in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
And so the whole time I was there, people would whisper about this like legendary party scene of the University of Virginia and Charlottesville throughout the 80s and the late 80s. Oh man, you wouldn't believe the shit they used to do here, blah 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 blah. But none of that happens now because
Right.
everyone got busted. It's all over. And like when I got to Boston, it was like, oh man, you just missed it. This was the epicenter of this and that, and there was all this stuff, and but now it's a bunch of IT workers moonlighting as rock bands.
Yeah.
They've got great websites, and that was my experience.
Yeah.
So.
And we met through remember the noise board in Boston?
I do remember the noise board, and in fact, we met. My band, the Medea Connection, played with Presley.
Yeah.
At a noise board show put
Right.
together by the noise board's webmaster, Nancy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a time we shared a venue. I don't know if I actually met you at that show. I don't know.
Yeah. I know. But the noise board, I just remember being. We were on there, but there was ended up being like a branch off board because it was just a lot of noise. So it was we had like a smaller one for a while, and
yes,
the more of like more likable people. Anyway.
Yeah, it was. This is it's so funny. There was a while. I think for Tanya and I, we did a band in Boston for a very long time, and it was just the two of us. And I think our experience was that it wasn't. We didn't like know anything about it. We weren't part of like any kind of like. We had never been like cool music scene people,
right?
And so we were just like playing shows, and I think we had completely unrealistic expectations for how it would work and how hard you would have to work, and just how socially weird it would be.
Right.
And I think I was on the noise board, I think at first thinking I was supposed to be promoting my band.
Yep.
But eventually it became like when I was in college, I was on like news groups.
Oh yeah, I remember those. Like
alt music, alternative, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you could get into music arguments with strangers, and I really liked that. So the noise board was basically that.
Yeah.
And so, I could be like, oh, I really enjoy the music of Loverboy.
Right.
And everyone would be like, that's really stupid. And then 5 people would say, me too. And then those wound up being the people I hung out with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's, because actually I think the first time I actually met you, and I came to your house and we watched the Journey documentary with Mike Baldino. So
Yes, exactly.
when you would zero in on those people and those boards where, we didn't like this stuff. Ironically, it was just I actually like Journey and and Styx. So and I'm not afraid to admit it. So it was cool to meet other people that because that's what a lot of those message boards are, and even social media now. It's just people wanting to show how cool they are with their tastes or whatever. So
I don't know. It's very strange. I think about this a lot because, on the one hand, so everyone wants to be cool, but on the other hand, if you are very earnest about your weird thing you're into, you become like this weird fetishist.
Right.
So like on Facebook, sometimes you find yourself members of groups that you're like, what the fuck am I? Why am I constantly being bombarded with weird like fanatics of early '70s Genesis? And I'm like, oh right, because I'm one of those fanatics.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But these people are fucking weirdos.
Right.
And and I feel like sometimes there's like a fine line because you want to find people that are that you can like chat about music with or find out interesting things, which was what was always great about things like the Noise Board. But it always runs the risk of becoming niche.
Right. Yeah.
And at the same time, if you go in the other direction, then it's a bunch of people that don't like anything.
Right.
And that becomes a drag as well.
Yeah, it's just counterproductive discussion of music when people are just like, oh, that sucks. That sucks. That's
Which honestly, what really surprises me is how much that unites people.
I know.
Suck. It's really the older I get too, the more remarkable it is how many people really enjoy not liking things.
Yeah, no,
exactly. Performatively.
Yeah. Game of Thrones, any of this kind of just being the contrarian seems like I don't know. It's one thing to troll and be funny about it, like I kind of try to do, and then there's another thing when just collectively, Game of Thrones is probably the biggest example currently for that.
I would agree. I think I don't know. It's really funny. I've also thought a lot about being a contrarian because I think a lot of times I think if you really care about something a lot, you wind up becoming a contrarian because you get frustrated with other opinions when you think about them too much.
Yeah.
And also, if you're really interested in music, you're basically interested in debating music and in working out, because there are no right answers. And so, I don't know. I feel like you enter into a post-high school environment where you're like, okay, Led Zeppelin is good. So you go in with like, Led Zeppelin is good. And then people will be like, they suck. And you'd be like, how can you think that? They're good. They're Led Zeppelin. It's like water. You drink it. It's wonderful. And they're like, no, they suck because their songs are really sexist and they're really long and their songs are really boring and they're all about dragons and you're like, well, there's some interesting ideas there, but I disagree. Although I would say that the lyrical Tolkien content reveals that they probably didn't really read the book very closely. And people will be like, oh, well, no, I wasn't talking about that. I just wanted to make fun of Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, well, and so some people, so some people it goes as far as this sucks.
Yeah,
and I don't know. To me, it's kind of like, I think if you at all have a mental life where you are occasionally depressed about things, you can usually gauge it, how good or bad you're doing by like how much you enjoy music.
Right.
So like if you're like, music is awesome or this music is awesome, then you're probably doing all right. But if you're like, man, everything sucks, this music sucks, I hate music, I hate the music I used to like, that's usually like a red flag. Right. And so like a lot of times, and the reason I bring that up is not to like get depressing. It's more like a lot of times when I talk to people or interact with people online where everything sucks, I always think, man, you must, are you guys, you're just depressed about everything? Because otherwise I have no ability to interact with this like depressing.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk you off a ledge. I just want to talk about music.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. No, I have to kind of cut those in. And I was that guy for a long time. And I think when I met you in like Baldino, you kind of got me out of that, because I was always like, oh, there's no good new music. And then I think I heard like this first Strokes record. I finally gave that or something like that, and I was like, oh, there's some cool, you know. And then I just sort of got rid of that, which I'm glad I did.
Well, I will say though that like you're a person and you exist in a time, and you don't have a lot of say over what that time period is,
right,
and what the mood of that time is. And so like, the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, the 90s sucked, the 2000s sucked, these were terrible times, this music was shit, the culture was shit, everything was not serious, right, and not interesting. And like at any given time, you can cherry pick things and be like, well, that was cool, or that was cool, but it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And so I feel like when you grow up loving classic rock, you have a wide acceptance of things, but also an understanding that your own time means nothing, and music is best appreciated as history.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see anything wrong with. I don't see anything incorrect about that. You know, like,
right,
like it's. I imagine being like the biggest Jimi Hendrix fan in the world, and then he fucking dies.
Right.
3 years after you've heard of him,
yeah,
you'd be like, oh, this is the worst time in the world. You know, whereas 30 years later, you're like, all right, the 30th Hendrix compilation's coming out. Right. I'm in heaven. Like, so much music. That's our childhood. That's my childhood, at least. Right. You know, you imagine like being I don't know, man. You imagine being like a young music obsessive in 1971, and like everyone's died,
I know,
and
right?
Like everything's depressing, and Nixon's about to be elected. You're like, man, I would not have chosen this time. But like when I was in high school, I thought that was the apex of everything.
Oh yeah.
And like I wished I lived in 1971, 72, 73. It's funny that way. You know what I mean? I think about that a lot. Like
when you were in college, were you doing writing too, like writing music, like writing about music?
No.
And
okay. It's really funny. I started writing. I started writing for the Phoenix in 2007 and 2008.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to that, my writing about music was almost zero. I did a few things for the Weekly Dig. But mostly I just it was like message boards and news groups in college. But the funny thing is that I started reading music criticism, and so like two main things I read that they didn't like make me want to write, because I didn't write when I read them, but they made me wish I was as good as them, was number one, Chuck Eddy.
Yeah.
So Chuck Eddy wrote this book that I read in high school called Stairway to Hell.
Yeah.
That's ostensibly 500 best heavy metal albums of all time. It is not that at all.
Right.
And it is like he has a definition of metal that most people would make steam come out of their ears. And mostly the whole book is an argument starter. All of his entries are basically ripping apart things. There is no Iron Maiden or Judas Priest in the book.
Right.
And I remember it was the kind of book where, like, when I was in high school, I used to go to like B. Dalton and look in the music section. I would see this book, and like or whatever. And the other one is, I can't remember.
Walden
and like
books.
I would. Yes, Walden books. And like, man, and like, I remember like reading entries of this book and like being like, ho, that's so funny. Or like, ho, I don't understand this.
Right.
And it was like, and it was this thing where like, I don't know if everyone feels this way about music, but sometimes, especially in the pre-digital world, you would dip a toe into something that would display just how much you don't know.
Right.
And reading snippets of his book was like, what the fuck is any of this stuff? Like, Led Zeppelin's number one. Okay, that makes sense. There's some Van Halen on here. I understand. I've heard of Van Halen. But then when he's like listing his favorite Last Exit album,
right?
You're like, what is this? Like, what is this music you're talking? I've never even heard of this. Like, I've never heard of the references you're making. Like, and then, I think basically your average person, at least of our generation, I don't know how people do this now, they get into music somehow. Sibling, friend, significant other, want to impress the guy or girl. And at a certain point, they're like on the edge of the diving board. Like, okay, I could become an enormous nerd here, or I could just walk away from this. This is too much.
Right, yeah.
I think everyone faces that moment at some age
right.
where they're like, okay, I could spend a lot of time learning about some arcane nonsense here,
right.
or not. And money. There was a lot of money then, too.
Yeah.
You wouldn't even have access to stuff. Like, I remember in college meeting this dude who had like, he'd become like a Jesus freak.
Right.
But a few years before, he was a reggae fanatic, and he was telling me about it when he was trying to proselytize to me.
Yeah.
The University of Virginia, by the way, had a lot of Jesus freaks.
Yeah.
He's like, yes, man. I used to own 500 reggae albums, but I threw them all away and I was at the time, it was 92, 93. I was like, I didn't know there were 500 reggae albums. I was like, I thought there was 2. Bob Marley Legend and Harder They Fall soundtrack. There are more?
Right.
500? Holy shit. So, like, I don't know. I think, so I think at a certain point, I was like, that appealed to me.
Yeah. So the Chuck
and you're obviously the same way.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, you go down this path, and usually you have other people that have drawn you into this. So for me, in high school, my best friend Jason Smith was on the noise board as JWS.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
So we both grew up in Syracuse, and he was a music obsessive, and he kind of got me into it.
Yeah.
But we would always talk about this, especially when we were in college. We're like, what the fuck are we doing? Like, why are we so into this nonsense? Like,
who are some of the bands you guys were getting into?
I mean, it was classic rock.
Yeah, like Jethro Tull.
It was classic rock. Jethro Tull. I was so into Jethro Tull. I was so into Jethro Tull in high school. Like, if you had asked me at any point in high school, the last 2 or 3 years of high school, what is your favorite album? I would say Thick as a Brick.
Yeah.
Like, it was just like, you buy the cassette, it has one song on each side.
Yeah.
I remember once going on a family skiing trip, and I was skiing downhill, and I was listening to Thick as a Brick on a Walkman. And, like, that was, like, the extreme sports music I wanted to listen to when I was like listening to headphones doing downhill skiing. Like, I think about it now. Like, I went skiing with my kids a few months ago in winter, and I was thinking, when I was in high school, I was skiing listening to Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull. Like, I was so fucking out to lunch. Like, I couldn't even like explain that to most people. Like, yes, well, we had these things called Walkmans, and I purchased this cassette, and it was a 40-minute concept album, and don't let me get you started on what it's about. And I thought, I didn't think, I wasn't being ironic, it wasn't funny.
Right.
I didn't even know much about Jethro. I had no, they were a current band. They had, they were like, had won a Grammy and shit. They were played on classic rock radio. Like, they were not obscure to me. I don't know. It's so weird. Like, I just think back, and from like a classic rock upbringing, it's like, I don't know. It's like being a robot being fed the wrong information or something.
Right.
Like,
I feel like most of my good friends have that background though. They started with that kind of stuff, and because that's what we had. I think, especially where I was in the suburbs, and some of it's embarrassing when you look back on it. But I'm not.
The thing is, like, to me, it's not embarrassing. It's more like music was detached completely from any like in-person physical experience.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine like Led Zeppelin. Like, there's no way I would ever be able to meet them or see them, and or be within 20 feet of Jimmy Page, or and now you can tweet to The
other thing that was really different, and I think about this a lot, was we didn't like know anything about this stuff.
Yeah.
You would buy a cassette, so you had to buy it,
Right.
unless you knew someone who would tape it for you.
Yeah.
You buy a cassette. I'm telling you, but you know this.
Yeah.
You buy the cassette, and there's nothing in it.
Yeah.
There's no liner notes.
Right.
There isn't really even the album cover most of the time.
Yeah.
I have tapes that were like bought tapes where it was like spelled wrong.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I recently,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
last week, I went to see Robyn Trower. He played
Oh,
Portland.
yeah, I saw that. Yeah, yeah.
And like, what always cracks me up was I bought this greatest hits of his in high school that I used to play all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But on the side it said Robyn Thrower, and like I always just think of him as Robyn Thrower. And I kept looking. I was at this concert like cracking up to myself about Robyn Thrower. I had like a Lou Reed greatest hits that was READ. Like these were store bought. They're not Russian. Like
Right.
they were real. But like, you know, you'd buy this cassette. It had no information on it.
Yeah.
I guess you could go to the library and look up the music section that had rock books, but there was
Right.
pretty much nothing if they were
Yeah.
not the Who or the Rolling Stones.
Right.
And so you just knew no information. At least
Yeah.
I knew nothing.
Yeah.
And I remember years later, VH1 used to show those like behind the music episodes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember one time my Tanya's younger brother, he's a 40-year-old man at this point. Her younger brother was like telling me about having recently watched the behind the music on Grand Funk Railroad. And he was like rattling off these interesting factoids about
Right.
Grand Funk Railroad. I was way into Grand Funk
Yeah.
Railroad, and like he didn't like know any of their music, but he knew
Right.
all these like interesting tidbits about them.
Huh.
And I was like, man, it's all backwards. Like, you know, like, you know, all the interesting things, but you don't know that, you know, the live album
Right.
is like the most rad record that was ever made. Like,
Right.
you know, the 20-minute drum solo and, you know, shit
Yeah.
like that. So I guess in some ways I'm glad that I was forced to go into this stuff with so little
Yeah.
information and so much. There was just so much mythology
Right.
that was not checked. There was not fact checked.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, you like Led Zeppelin? Oh, did you know that, you know, this and this, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Like, you're like,
Yeah, there was
whoa,
so many of
that's
those.
crazy. That
Yeah.
makes me find it way more interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There was always that kind of. I remember like some kid in my high school or junior high said Neil Peart had needles, and when he would play double bass, and these needles would inject like speed into his legs.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, okay. You know, but of course I was 12 going, wow, really? That's crazy.
Right.
And you would or like, you know, Ozzy throwing, you know, a bag of puppies into the crowd and that kind of stuff. And, you know,
Right.
there was nowhere to fact check that stuff. So
it's really odd. When I was writing for the Phoenix, one of the things I became somewhat evangelical about was the pernicious effect of Kickstarter.
yeah, yeah,
And I was right, but I was wrong. Like, it didn't matter, but I was right.
right,
Which was basically that once bands started communicating directly with their fans
mm-hmm.
and hitting them up for money, that it was all, the jig was up.
right,
That was how I felt. It was hard to explain why I felt that, because who cares, and it was whatever. But like, I remember thinking, the bands I grew up worshiping, or the artists I grew up worshiping, if they had ever personally communicated with me in something other than a fan club mediation,
right,
I would have not liked them.
right. Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I feel like it's because we grew up in a world where there was mythology, where you could build up your own mythology, and it made up for, if the music wasn't interesting, you could imagine the music being more interesting,
Right.
because the people behind it were interesting.
Yeah.
And now everyone just knows too much. It's odd because everyone's like, oh, this is a time of fake news, and oh, this is a time of everything is fake, and the internet is spreading lies all the time. Perhaps, but sometimes it's a little too true. Like, people know tidbits of trivia about people that they could never care about their music or care about them as like an important figure. And so I feel like bands need to build up, or artists in general need to build up this mask of interestingness before it's all deflated when you find out that they're not really that interesting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, you know, when you interview people, they're not that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And that's fine. Like by that point, you know their music. You're the one asking them a question.
Right.
And so it's okay. They don't have to be interested. They can just be characters.
Right. Yeah. And so you did writing. When you first started writing for the Phoenix, were you doing like live reviews and music reviews, or were you interviewing artists?
The first thing I ever did was I had started doing reviews for the Weekly Dig when Mike Broder was the editor there. Yeah. He left, and the people that were editing after him were like terrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so one of the last things I had submitted to him was I had we were after Medea Connection. We were in that band. We were in the band called The Hidden, and we recorded a few albums with Steve Albini. Mm-hmm. And so this was a couple years after the band broke up, or maybe right when the band broke up. The Hidden did. Yeah. Tanya and I were in Italy and happened to see Shellac play, and I was like, I'm going to try to interview him. So I emailed him, and I interviewed him in person after his show, and I thought, oh man, I've got this like hot interview. I didn't know how it's worked. Right. This was a pitch first, and I just interviewed him first. He wasn't playing Boston or anything. Right. There was no demand for this interview. Yeah. So I was like, hey, Broder, I interviewed Steve Albini. Don't you want to publish this?
Right.
I talked to him for an hour and a half. Don't you want to print 10,000 words of Steve Albini? And he was like, yeah, let me get on that. And then that didn't happen. And then when he left the Dig, I contacted the Phoenix and told them, and they managed miraculously. They were doing an issue about producers, and so they printed that, and I was like, wow, that was easy. Now I'm a writer. Yeah. And so there was a time before, about 4 years before, where for a magazine called Boston Soundcheck, I had interviewed Hank von Helvete, the singer of Turbo Negro. Yeah. And he was very interesting. Yeah. But that wound up being an underwhelming experience. Trying to get that. And so I was always working a day job, and so I after the Albini thing, I pitched a few other things to the Phoenix that didn't come to fruition, and then eventually Broder became the music editor of the Phoenix, and then I pitched him some more things, and eventually I was like one of the first big interviews I did for the Phoenix was I got to interview Geddy Lee, and and it was right when Snakes and Ladders had come out. Yeah. So it was Rush at their height. Yeah, definitely. So like, it was, and that was like a very sobering experience of like how to do this shit, because they were like, Atlantic Records tells me, okay, you have 10 minutes with Geddy Lee. And
was that over the phone, or was that in person?
It was over the phone, and I almost completely I almost lost the recording I had of it. My interview was a stammering mess. Yeah. I literally referred to the album as Shoots and Ladders twice in the interview, and like.
I think it's
so. What would you say? What would you say are the themes to Shoots and Ladders?
Oh,
or
right.
The Shoots and Ladders tour seems like it's going really well. Those kind of
right.
God. Just thinking about it makes me upset. And so after that I felt like I had to try harder.
Yeah. You had an experience with John Lydon over the phone, didn't you?
Oh, John Lydon. Yeah, he was. It's really fascinating. I feel like when a lot of times by the time I interviewed someone that was really not just famous, but like someone interesting, it was always at their, I'm not going to say their saddest moment, but it's like they really need to get butts in seats for some show,
right?
And they're just doing the rounds. And so when I talked to John Lydon, PIL was doing a tour in, this would have been 2012. That I think the album was called This Is Pill.
Yeah,
and it was actually a pretty good record.
Yeah.
They were kind of on a tear. He had a good band then.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh wow, I'm going to interview Johnny Rotten. He's one of those guys who just, he picks up the phone, it's some person interviewing him.
Right.
And he's just like, okay, I can just spout 10 minutes at a time.
Right.
Doesn't matter what the fuck you say.
Right.
So what I remember really well was I was thrown off because he was in fucking England or whatever, or wherever he was, and so I had to Skype call him.
Right.
And I was having all these like technical difficulties at the beginning, and so like a lot of these kind of things, it's like you call their record label or PR, and they're like, okay, let me get John on the other end, and I kept getting like, and I was going like, hello, and it took like 5 or 10 minutes for me to get him on the line, and by the time I got him, I was like, I was on like lunch break at work, and like in my car, I was like sweating it out, and so my first question was like, so Johnny Lydon, do you think that? And he was like, young man, he's like, first of all, you're going to have to slow down, and second of all, I can't understand a goddamn word you're saying, and blah, 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 blah. I was like, awesome. So, like, the thing is, I kind of love that. It was great because usually people are too polite, and they're like, have no idea what you're saying, and they're like, oh, not really understanding that question, and you're like, oh, boy. So, it's kind of funny. I don't know, like the people like that, they're interesting. Yeah. And you realize that that's kind of how they were able to persevere and make it. Oddly enough, another example of that was when I interviewed Ian Anderson, who just wrote all years later. He too talked at me for 20 minutes while he was like packing for some whole tour. They were like, yes, Ian will, call Ian at this time. He's about to fly off to Russia and he's got 10 minutes to talk to you or whatever. And like, he was calling me and like, he called me early. Right. And so what's really funny is I still have on my phone, he like left me a message because he called 10 minutes before we were supposed to talk. And he's like, hello, this is Ian Anderson calling for Daniel. I see that you're not here, so perhaps I will call back later. Whatever, you're annoying the shit out of me. Like, he was like really annoyed sounding. like, it's absolutely awesome because he's Ian Anderson. And like, and it's like he really talks like that. And so John Lydon was the same way. He really talks like that. He's like, and he's touchy and he gets pissed off. Like I was like, at one point I said something about like, when you first started PAL, was the idea to like deconstruct, the rock punk you were doing in the Sex Pistols. He's like, deconstruct? There was no deconstruction. Deconstruction means you're taking something apart. I would never dare dream of doing something like that. We were building something. Okay, buddy. Yeah, use the wrong word, but you know basically what I mean. Like, exactly.
That's funny. On the other hand, I remember you did James Williamson, and that was you got pretty in depth with him, like about.
Yeah, it's funny because I interviewed when I was at the Dig. One of the interviews I did, now that I remember it, before I was at Phoenix, was I interviewed Ron Ashton.
Oh, nice.
And at the time, the Stooges were reunited, and like that seemed pretty unlikely.
Right.
And I remember at the time, Iggy Pop did a solo album, and he did like a couple songs with the Stooges, and then he did some kind of tour of some kind that wound up stopping at the Alewife Fresh Pond Newbury Comics. Oh, okay. I don't know if you were at that show. There was one of those shows where like everyone was at that show, and he played acoustic.
Oh, I remember.
And like the fucking drummer from the Stooges was playing bongos or on a buckets or whatever. Right. And so I interviewed Ron Ashton around that time. I think before he did that really bad album called The Weirdness that they did with Steve Albini that is basically not a good record. Yeah. And Ron Ashton was psyched because
Yeah.
like, finally was. That was actually a very interesting one. I know this is the James Williamson one you were asking about, but like, Ron Ashton was so interesting because he revealed things that I didn't know.
Right.
Like, he basically wanted Iggy Pop's attention for like 25 years and just couldn't get it.
Yeah.
Like, he's just rotting away doing other things, doing like manual labor. And like, finally Iggy Pop, who, he kept saying, yeah, Iggy in his mansion in Miami called me and I went down and had me record a song. It's like, you could tell Ron Ashton could like, while he was alive, obviously, if you were like, hey, write a song, he'd be like, sure, no problem. Do, there you go. Stooges. I got it. It's magic. I can do it anytime you want. Like, I'm Ron Ashton. I can pull this shit out of my ass. I'm really good at this. Yeah. And, but Iggy Pop, not so much the same kind of magician. And so I remember a couple of years, it must have been 2010 when I talked to James Williamson. By that point, Ron Ashton was dead, and they were reuniting with Williamson, and they were doing kind of a Kill City tour.
Okay.
And so I think like a year or two later, they actually put out an album with James Williamson. I can't remember. It's called like Ready to Die. Right. Yes. And okay, it's actually kind of a good record. Yeah. But it's fucking Iggy Pop with like wrapped in like bombs holding a detonator. It's like literally like why did you do this?
2010.
And what's even worse is like, to me, the best song on that record is this song called Double D's, which is like, it's like Iggy Pop's one of those people that like, the song is so great and you're like, God, you're such a fucking cheeseball. Why do I like this? Like,
it's like David.
And that's how I feel about that song. Anyway, like the song is so rad, and I can't like ever play it to anyone and be like, what do you think? Yeah. So it's kind of like his perfect poison pill. Right. But when I talked to James Williamson, I like right off the bat, I was like, hey, when I spoke to the late Ron Ashton, he told me that the Fun City, the Funhouse lineup is the real Stooges. What do you think of that? And like, as soon as it left my mouth, I was like, why would I say such a thing to this awesome dude? Like, hey, this dead guy that got demoted to bass when you got in the band thought that your version of the band was illegitimate. What thoughts? Otherwise, he was awesome, and like his take on raw power is what you'd expect. They were an awesome band, and it was hard to record it because they did not properly go the right route, and he had a singer who was a massive drug addict. Like they were all degenerates. Right. So, otherwise, they were like the best rock band in the world, except no one saw it or knew it.
Right. You must have found, too, with certain artists, when they find out that the person talking to them kind of knows what they're talking about and is maybe a fan, but not, getting too, excited to talk to them, or fanboying out, or whatever you would call that. I feel like some artists probably enjoy that, and, it's a relief from just having someone go, so how's the tour going?
It's funny. Most people don't want a fanboy, but they want someone who knows a little of what they're talking about and has some insight. Right. Like, okay, I interviewed Danzig one time, and it was I can't remember the fucking album he put out. Like, he epitomizes what a lot of artists are like, which is when you get them on the phone. I mean, they're handed a phone by like a PR person, right? And so they don't know what the fuck they're going to be dealing with. I actually really feel for them. You can barely hear them. They can barely hear you. Right. Who knows where they are? Half of the interviews I did, they were clearly, the person was in a car.
Yeah, or doing something. You can hear them.
Like, I got so many interrupted by like, oh, my kid is whatever, or, or whatever. So many times. But like, Danzig was so guarded. Yeah. And I remember I asked him a question about, like, something about like the themes of his music, and he goes, oh, I think I said something about how his music was gestated. That was the word I used. Right. And he was like, oh, oh, I see, this is going to be one of these kind of interviews. He's like, I don't normally talk to people who use words like gestate.
Oh, Jesus.
And I was like, oh, really? And like, the funny thing was, like, when I talked to him, I was obsessed with this videotape that came out circa the first Danzig album. It was like this home video.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's like this
Def
weird
Jam
film of him. It is such hysterical beauty.
Yeah.
And at one point, he's sitting in what I think is his house, talking about his book collection.
Right.
So I wanted to talk to him about books and his book collection, because I felt like he was more forthcoming when he was pontificating about his own intellectual pursuits.
Right. Yeah.
And so I wound up talking to him about, he just went on and on about like how much he loves hunting down arcane, basically conspiracy theory nonsense. That's his big thing.
Yeah.
He went on all these tangent rants about Obama and the conspiracies about, quote unquote, the Bilderbergers, I was just sitting there going, all right, Jews run the world and Obama is terrible. And at the time when I spoke to him, it was, God, this feels like a million lifetimes ago. There was the Deepwater Horizon explosion had happened. So there was an oil leak in the Gulf of Mexico that was going on for like 2 months.
Right.
And so in his mind, this was proof that Obama was letting it go on to appease his global superiors, to like prove to him that he was in the pocket of George Soros or whatever.
Right.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
Man, this is, like I said, this feels like a million lifetimes ago.
Right.
This is like, I don't know, this is like, Disney having to talk about having made Song of the South or something. I'm like, man, I can't believe this was real, and I didn't think it was that crazy at the time. But but he was going off about that, and then he was talking about like going to bookstores and how much he loves rooting around for stuff. And then he's like, I got this guy on my road crew that really loves motorcycles, and I went to all these bookstores trying to find this one book, and he's like, I'm really good at finding obscure stuff if I'm really motivated. And he was getting all like this was like what he's really into.
Right.
And I was like, wow,
that's
this is the real Danzig. He's a lonely guy on tour a lot.
Yeah.
That really is, the people he's surrounded with is people in his crew, and he just wants to show them that he cares about them by rooting around in bookstores by himself. And I thought, I can identify with that.
Yeah, definitely.
I like that. I was like, you know what, Danzig, even though you're a fucking nutcase, you're all right. Yeah. And then 10 minutes in the conversation, his PR person's like, okay, we're all done. Right. Bye.
Yeah, they're like, all right, you're giving up too much. What are you doing?
It's weird because like the purpose of an interview for a publicity place is like you are doing them a solid.
Right.
You are doing something for them that they like. So there's this negotiation before you even speak to the artist, and then after you speak to the artist. And like after I talked to James Williamson, his publicist was mad at me that we didn't speak more explicitly about the then new triple CD reissue of Raw Power. They're like, I thought we had agreed that we were. I was like, fuck that. I'm talking to James Williamson.
Right.
I'll ask him whatever I want. Like, fuck you. Right. I don't work for a record company. Like, I'm barely getting paid to do this. So, yeah.
Now, have you ever? I think I've suggested it before. Have you ever thought of collecting some of your writing and trying to publish it?
Yeah, I used to.
I know you get the.
I probably should. I feel like I have. If I burrowed through a bunch of interviews, there would be some interesting stuff. The funny thing is that I had kids,
right,
and the Phoenix went under, somewhat in that order,
right,
and my writing changed because I cared less.
Right.
And my writing became more depressive.
Yeah.
Because I was not I didn't have to write for the Phoenix. So instead I could write what I wanted. And when I wrote what I wanted, it was more like what do I want to write about? Well, and then it becomes more of an outlet for like, the feeling that the world is ending, filtered through the fact that streaming services are supplanting mom and pop stores or something, and then that's where you wind up.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like I also wrote at the worst time.
In the history of music.
Like it was like everything was folding up shop like as I was doing it. Mm-hmm. So, I interviewed Peter Gabriel once, but like, who cares? Like no one read it.
Right.
I interviewed, all sorts of hyped artists, but it was like, it didn't mean what I guess I had thought. I think I thought, I'm going to interview all these people, and when you step back from it, you're going to see this like really interesting story of music.
Yeah.
And the truth is, no. Like, if it was actual journalism, you'd talk to a bunch of people and it would tell a story.
Right.
But music is just like these weird snippets of like talking to famous people when they and their label have agreed to talk to you.
Right.
And so it's hard to say what it really tells you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so I'm interested in when I go back and read these things, because I'm like, oh, that was interesting.
Right.
Like, I don't know. I remember one time I talked to Robyn Hitchcock.
Nice. And
it was one of those deals where the Phoenix was like, hey, you want to interview Robyn Hitchcock? And I was like, yeah, and no one else would. Apparently other people only interview people that they like or actively.
Right.
I don't understand these people. I would have interviewed anyone. I interviewed Yanni. Like, I don't care. Like, yeah, just sign me up. Put me on the phone. So, like, I talked to Robyn Hitchcock, and like prior, the day before, I went and like listened to every one of his records. Right. I was like, oh, okay, this guy's interesting. Is someone that like I hadn't paid a lot of attention to.
Yeah.
And then when I talked to him for like an hour, and he was like this like philosophical guru or something. Mm-hmm. He's like reality is just a membrane that stretches across the gaping chaos that is the machinations of the world underneath it, and your day-to-day life. You never know. I was like, whoa, that's pretty heavy. I hadn't thought of it that way. Wow, that's interesting. Like, but I don't know what utility that is to your average person, divorced from the like publication it was in. So someday, but I don't know. I feel like it inflates the value of it to begin with.
Yeah. Did you ever?
I'm sure you know the feeling.
Yeah. Do you ever? You were talking earlier about the mystery of artists when we were younger, and you didn't know much about it. Once you started being able to actually, you read stuff, but then you're taking it to the next level with actually meeting people. Did you ever think you were sort of becoming part of this, like taking away the mystery of artists by having to, meet with them and actually?
It's a really good question. I mean, I used to go into interviews when I was interviewing people, and I thought to myself, I'm going to ask the question that someone would want to know if they were a fan of this artist,
right,
without being a jerk about it. Like if you get 10 minutes with Rob Halford, what are you going to talk to him about?
Right.
Which I did one time. And I'm like, and so I always wound up talking to them about like, how did they start? Because I feel like the one thing that is definitely true is that most people who do not play music or do not interface with the music business in an intimate way do not understand properly how people go from beginning to being famous.
Right.
Everything skips over that. And most artists themselves don't know much about it either, unless they worked really hard. Right. So there are people who worked really hard, and they will tell you, I worked really hard. There are people who lucked into it by chance, and they tend to be, I had no plan. I talked to a bunch of people that had no plan.
Right.
So I remember I interviewed Belinda Carlisle. She had no plan.
Yeah.
I talked to MIA. She had no plan. So many people had no plan.
Right.
I was like, wow, you had no plan. That's interesting. Rob Halford had a plan, but his plan was working really hard for 10, 15 years and whoring themselves to anything they could until they made it. And like, if the label told them to jump, they were like, can I wear leather when I jump?
Right.
And, all of which is acceptable. Like, all of which is perfectly fine by me.
Right.
I don't know what people... I feel like once you're reading an interview with an artist, to be honest, you are puncturing any myth anyway.
Right.
I think when you're a kid and you live in a time where artists are mythical beings, you weren't reading interviews with these artists, or if you did, it was like heavily doctored, like the liner notes of a box set or something.
Yeah.
Where they were trying to...
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, if you go back and look at like Circus magazine, there was nothing really in there of any like value aside from just pictures of artists. I think the writing in a lot of those was just didn't tell you much.
Yeah, I feel like most artists who are famous, especially, I think if you really got down to it, they would probably tell you that they are misunderstood by people that they talk to.
Right.
And what they're most upset by is people who are trying to get them to say something that they didn't really mean.
Right.
And I feel bad for that because it's always going to be true.
Right.
And I know that myself, like if I think back again on my interview with Danzig, he said all this batshit stuff.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there like, ka-ching, like, awesome.
Right.
Keep talking, buddy.
Right.
Like, like, this is gold.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, you are going off. This is wonderful. Like, and like, so, yeah, I feel like at that moment, I was definitely of dubious value to anyone because on the one level, people like you and I could guffaw at the crazy shit he was saying. Like, yes. But that's because we have a perverse understanding of someone like Danzig.
Right.
You have a perverse love for him. You love him, but you kind of hate him.
Yeah.
Like, you kind of like, oh, you are such a fucking weirdo.
Right.
Oh, you are such a terrible person.
Right.
Oh, but I absolutely love listening to you say this horrible stuff that is so interesting.
Morrissey's another one of those for me, I would say.
Like Morrissey, Morrissey, I remember he put out that autobiography.
Yeah.
And I read it very slowly.
Right.
Because it was like drinking limoncello or something. It was like every sentence you're like, oh, this is exquisite. This is so ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's concentrated. It's like, you can't just release this book. Like, it's too hard to read. It's too good. Like, every paragraph, you're like, oh, this is like you boiled down to a paragraph, and then there's another one after it. That's what talking to Danzig was like, too. It's like you have these people, you want the essence, but they sometimes give you too much of it.
Right.
And it gives you like a fucking headache. It's like, whoa, you are too much.
Right.
Whereas some guys are just cool dudes, and like they're the less interesting ones.
Right.
I mean, music culture, rock culture, it's made for maniacs. And like when you're a person just growing up and consuming it, you want to be like you and I both did bands.
Yeah.
At the end, at a certain point, you realize you aren't one of those people.
Right. Yeah.
I can pinpoint mine too.
Yeah.
Tanya and I, when we were doing Medea, we played a show with High on Fire.
Oh yeah.
In 2002, and they played the Linwood.
Yeah.
And I interviewed Matt Pike a few times years later, and he's always funny.
Yeah.
But like, so we were hanging out with Matt Pike. There's actually a backstage at the Linwood.
Yeah.
There was this little room, and so we're hanging out with Matt Pike. Matt Pike was a very nice guy. He was, at that time, he was a pretty good-looking guy. He was shirtless, long hair, wearing leather pants, literally swigging from a fifth of Jack Daniels.
Even back then, he was shirtless?
Yes, and regaling Tanya and I with tales of the road.
Right.
And I remember we both, like, left that hanging out with him, and we were like, we're never going to make it.
Right.
Like, we're not that guy.
Yeah.
Like, he has no other option. He
Right.
is a rock star.
Yeah.
He is a rock god.
Yeah.
Like, he's like a toothless guy who goes through, like I just saw him in Portland, High on Fire played Portland like last week.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But he was basically making up he canceled a whole tour.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
had diabetes and had to have
year.
a toe cut off
Yeah.
and shit like that. Like,
Yeah.
he's got the most fucked up life. But that's what happens when you're the shirtless, long-haired,
Yeah.
leather pants guy drinking from the fifth of Jack that then just walks right out and is like, all right, me and these three guys all wearing matching flame pendants are going to now play High on Fire music for an hour and a half. Like, they're committed.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't stress this enough. Like, at a certain point you realize, like, rock and roll is a committal, and it's kind of like going to prison or joining a gang or something that is bad. Committing to something that is a bad idea. That's like what they do.
Right.
And like most people will go. That's why I like the whole like Steve Albini 90s thing where it was all like bands should be ethical.
Right.
Our labels should be ethical. You should only hang out with Ian MacKaye and do nice things and like never rip off people. I'm like, there's a certain truth. There's a certain Spartan honesty to what you're saying. On the other hand, we all know that people who succeed in music are scumbags and they're bad people, and rock is bad, and like music is bad, and like committal to this is a highway to ruining things. And like, this is what our parents told us. Like, it's all true. Like, like I feel like sometimes I totally felt that and like just thought like I couldn't even, if I did this, I would be like the kid smoking cigars with Pinocchio. It turns into a donkey. Like, it's an odd metaphor. But.
Yeah. So you're not playing any music at this point, right?
No, not really. Yeah. I if I play guitar for 10 seconds, my kids are like, "Oh, it's too loud." So someday it'll happen. Yeah. Someday.
Nice.
I don't know. I mean, it's weird. I feel like you have to, whether it's writing about music or playing music or even just being like a music person, you have to like commit something that you will get nothing out of.
Right.
You will not be rewarded. Even if you're a big fan of music, the music's the reward. I remember once talking to Buzzo for the Melvins, maybe in 2011. Mm-hmm. He was always funny. Yeah. And it was right when everything was tanking and becoming streaming. And he was talking about putting out records, and he kept being like, we're going to have to, everything we put out is going to be some $30 vinyl specialty hoop-de-hoo. He's like, if you want the music, hey, the music's always free because it's all about the music, and we all love the music. The music's always free, but if you want the thing, we're going to rip you off because, that's all we can do now. And I was just like, man, like, he's right, but painful. Like, to hear, like, someone, especially someone you like their whole thing, you're like, you have been destroyed somehow by this. You have been decimated because, like, a system that you thought would go on forever didn't. Yeah. And then, I don't know. Then it's been 8 years since then, and I'm like, fuck it, that's the world. Like, that's the way of the world. Like, that's what we're all like looking at. Like, this thing that we thought would go on isn't. And grow up. Yeah. It's like it's harder for some things than others.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, I am going to wind this down. I thank you for taking the time to do this, man.
Of course,
fun.
Of course, it's great to catch up, Chris, and we'll have to chat another time, not on record. It'll be fun.
Yeah.